there's another one. Excellent. Right. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to try and address 3 questions, which actually Albert suggested. So I'm going to try and address those 3 questions through this talk. Is there a problem? No? Okay. Okay. So the first question is how resources should be designed in order to better serve our learning ecologies. And the second question is around future resources. Which kind of resources should teachers, developers and institutions create? Now, I'm really going to deal with that one right at the end. But because what I'm going to talk about to begin with relates to how to design resources, I just wanted to put that in there for good measure as well. So, I wish I could lose that. Can you lose? Okay, well, I'll tell you what it says. Because we're talking about designing resources, I just wanted to frame our thinking in terms of what one might say about design thinking for educators. So it's solution-focused rather than goal-oriented. It takes into account the conditions and circumstances now and in the future. And for me, that's very important because, as I said earlier this morning, conditions and circumstances are what encouraged me to look at context and ecologies. It's normally associated with architecture and construction and more recently technology. But increasingly we think about teachers as designers. So if we're expecting them to design resources, we need to get them to think as designers. And it's also a way to integrate technology into the classroom. But teachers often lack the skill to do this. So part of what I'm going to talk about is about how we might help teachers to do this more effectively. But just to start off with, I want to go back to what I was saying this morning very briefly and to put in place the basics of why I'm interested in learning ecologies. So as I said this morning, we all know context makes a difference to learning, but what is it? And what are the circumstances and conditions? So in this picture, you can see 2 different photographs. The little boy you can see here with the tabless PC is actually also in that classroom with sitting on the carpet, watching the same piece of material on the big screen. So the same child is watching the same piece of video, but it's a very different learning experience. Why? And that's the kind of question that prompted me to start asking, well, what is context? What do we mean by it? And how can we take it into account when we're designing resources? And that's very much what this presentation is about. But it's incredibly complex. It's messy. How do we simplify it? So we've got this messy situation. So who else would you look at? But it's got to be Albert Einstein, of course. You know, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So what is the right level of simplicity for thinking about context that means that we can take it into account without feeling completely overwhelmed by it? So that we can get to this kind of a stage where we've got something we can work with, we can see, and we can design with. So I spent quite a considerable amount of time looking at what we mean by context and what we mean by circumstances. And I found that there are a wide range of disciplines that consider these issues: geography, architecture, planning, cognitive and computer sciences, anthropology, psychology, education. They all talk about things that they call context or place or space or circumstances and conditions, but in very different ways. So I tried to pull this literature together to come up with a way of talking about context that I felt was useful. And this was it. And I'm sorry about the large amount of text on this screen, but I thought it was important to put this up. Because for me, a learner or a teacher, any person, but we're interested in learners here, is not exposed to multiple contexts. They're not things we go in and out of, but rather we each have our own single context that's our lived experience of the world. And I really like the phrase phenomenological gestalt from Manovich. And this reflects our interactions with multiple people, artifacts, and environments. For me, that means resources. So multiple interactions with multiple resources of different sorts. And these interactions offer us partial descriptions of the world that are our resources and that can act as hooks through which we can build meaning. And this is harking back to what I said earlier this morning about Vygotsky's notion of learning through the internalization of interactions. In this sense, meaning is distributed among these resources. But it's the manner in which the learner at the centre of their context internalizes their interactions that's the core activity of importance. And just like Norman said earlier, these interactions are not predictable, but are created by the people who interact, each of whom will have intentions about how these interactions should be. So this definition is core to what I do with context and with learning ecologies. And because I'm interested in learning, I wanted to be driven by a pedagogy, as I said this morning. So I look to the work of Vygotsky and this notion of interactions and interactions and intra-actions, i.e. inside the head and outside the head. And in particular, his concept of the zone of proximal development, which has multiple definitions. One is a very spatial definition, where it's the difference between what somebody can do on their own and what they can do with assistance. And the other definition is much more process-oriented. It's about creating the space for learning through interactions. And this fitted with this idea of context. So that's the theoretical underpinning for what I've been working on. But I found, like many other people, that Vygotsky's notion of the zone of proximal development I needed to interpret because it's quite complicated but quite underspecified. Not surprising, he died very young and wrote an awful lot in a short period of time, but it's very hard to operationalize. So came up with two additional concepts, the zone of available assistance and the zone of proximal adjustment. The zone of available assistance is all the resources. So I'm a learner here. At this particular moment in time, my zone of available assistance is all of you in the room, all the furniture, the lighting, the technology, my phone, my connection to the internet, the people I could contact via Twitter, everything is my zone of available assistance. And the zone of proximal adjustment is what we want to create, because those are the optimal interactions for learning. So that's what we create when we select particular resources and we support effective interactions with those resources. So that's what, as educators, we're trying to engineer in my conceptualization of context and learning ecologies, is that zone of proximal adjustment. And it might be that we engineer it by helping the student to do it for themselves. I'm not trying to present learning as being very didactic, where the teacher always does everything, but we, as facilitators, would need to help learners to construct their own zones of proximal adjustment. Right, that's quite enough theory. That's all the theory for now, but that kind of gives you... So in order to help me operationalize this notion of context, and I have to say at this point, my background is computer science and artificial intelligence. And from there, I came into education. Now, before I studied computer science and artificial intelligence, I had taught in primary schools, secondary schools, further education colleges. So I was a teacher first. But then I studied computer science and AI. And I think that means I look at things in a very particular sort of a way. So when I talk about operationalizing, somewhere at the back of my head, I've always got the thought, how would you program this? How would you make a computer do this? So you've got to specify things quite carefully. So that's where the language comes from. So we have our learner, and it's extremely important that the learner's in the centre, because after all, this is going to be their ecology of resources that we hope is going to support their learning. Now, this learner could be a teacher, trainee teacher, such as you were talking about, Albert, and I'm going to use a trainee teacher example later on. And there they are, lots of resources. They're not all the same, of course. This looks very homogenous, but they're all different. And it's quite hard to just think in terms of resources. So I found it useful to categorize these resources. So when I'm trying to identify resources, or when I'm helping teachers, for example, or learners to identify the resources they can use, it's quite useful to say, well, think about the people, think about the environment, think about these things, and then they're able to identify more resources. So in my first conceptualization of the ecology of resources, I had tools and people together, but that confused some people, so I've actually now separated them out. But I think in terms of resources are falling broadly into these categories. But the category into which a resource falls is determined by the role that it's playing for the person at the centre at a particular moment in time. So that means a resource might be in two different categories, depending on what role it's playing. So it's not a hard and fast. I mean, for some things it's perfectly obvious where they are, but the more, for example, that technology is integrated into the environment, one has to ask the question, does that make it a tool or is it the environment? If you've got technology embedded in the environment, which is it? And then it's a case of, well, what role is it playing? And can we use that to help us decide what category it goes in? So, to simplify things even further, this was the conceptualization I came up with, and the arrows in the circle indicate that the resources are connected. So, for example, the people in this room, I don't know what the relationships are between you, but I bet there will be relationships because you work in the same place, the same town, so some of you will know each other much better than others. So there are relationships between the resources. And then the learner is interacting with the resources. I think there's a question as to the extent that the arrow that links the learner to knowledge and skills is actually double-ended. Because the arrows mean influences, is related to influences. Now, most of the time, the learner is trying to understand the knowledge and skills. Not very often do they have an impact on the nature of those knowledge and skills, but I've still left it as two-way because I believe that learners could have an impact on knowledge and skills. For example, parkour is something that originated on the streets, but is now part of the official training of the British Army. So informal learning on the streets becomes formal learning that's turned into a curriculum. So it is possible. Now, as I said this morning, the way that we can interact with our resources is not necessarily straightforward. There may be physical boundaries, there may be social boundaries, there may be cultural boundaries, or filters, as I've called them. And sometimes these can be positive, and sometimes these can be negative, as I discussed earlier this morning. And going back to the notion of the zone of available assistance and the zone of proximal adjustment, this represents the zone of available of assistance. This is everything for this learner at this moment in time. And what we would be wanting to do is saying, right, what of this will make an optimal experience for the learner and can be their zone of proximal adjustment? I'm just going to take a drink there, sorry. Right, so I said I was going to focus on design. So let's go back to that first example of the video. Whoops. And we said it's different, it's a different experience. Why? And how can we take this into account when we're designing the video, or perhaps what surrounds the video, or the way the video is presented? Well, different ecologies, different contexts, different, more able partners. So different people who can assist the learner. For example, in the classroom context, it's the teacher and the classroom assistant and maybe friends. In the home, it's the mother or carer or other family member. There are different technologies. There are different rules and regulations in the classroom to the rules and regulations that there are in the home. And all of these things make a difference to how you would design resources to help in these different learning situations. And in particular, you might think about the role of people and thinking, well, how do I design knowing that there's a teacher and a teaching assistant there? Okay. Teacher and teaching assistant understand the curriculum. They know why the child is doing this activity. Parent at home doesn't. Probably need to give that parent some assistance, some extra information, so that they can help their child make the most out of this video. So, how can we use this concept of the ecology of resources, which is a way of looking at context, to design, and I've put in brackets and analyse because I use it a lot for analysing data to try and understand what's going on. Resources. So this looks very complicated, but it's not, which I'll simplify it in a minute. This is a design and an analysis framework that I developed about, 6 or 7 years ago, and have been using ever since. Basically, there are 3 phases. The first phase is about trying to map out your learners' ecology of resources. And it could be a group of learners. I'm not always talking about a single learner. They could be teachers. But to look at the resources that are available to the people that you're designing for, and to map them out, to look at precisely what it is you want to do with those resources, to identify what the learner brings to the situation, because the learner has their own resources. I'm going to say internal resources, but I worry when I say internal because that sounds like everything's inside the head and outside. But things like, what do they know about the subject you're going to teach them? How confident are they? Are they self-reflective? Are they motivated? All of those kind of things, the things that they bring. And then who are the more able partners that can help the learner in this situation? Bearing in mind that for Vygotsky, the more able partner was the key player who helps the child by assisting them to move forward and understand more. And mapping that out is often quite a lengthy process where you iterate through the steps more than once. But the outcome is worth the effort. And then phase 2 is about identifying the relationships between the resources. So the arrows in the diagram and the filters in particular, to see what resources already exist and whether you need to support those, what relationships already exist, and look at whether you need to support those relationships or maybe whether you want to develop new relationships. And then the third phase, which is very much about designing adaptive technologies, again, that's my background, is about developing how you would scaffold learning in this particular ecology of resources. And when I talk about scaffolding, I'm quite specific. I mean, how will you make timely interventions that suit an individual learner's needs precisely? And how will you remove that support at the appropriate point so that they can move forward? But you don't have to do all phases. And in actual fact, just doing phase 1 often opens people's eyes to resources they didn't realise they could use, and is a useful process in its own right. But as I said, putting it simply, identify potential resources, identify relationships within and between the resources and the filters, and develop ways to support the learning relationships that you identify and to overcome any barriers. That's it, much more simply. So how might you use this? That's told you about it, and it's told you about the model, and it's told you about the framework, but how can you use it? I've used it to design things, such as an application for a mobile phone, but actually more recently I've used it more for analysis. So we used it a lot in looking at lots of research that had been done in educational technology for an organisation called Nesta in the UK, and tried to identify within that literature what the conditions and circumstances of learning were as researchers were reporting their findings. The truth was there was very little information about the circumstances, so we all recognise they're important, but hardly anybody says anything about them, which is interesting, and for other occasions as well. But I thought I'd also show you some different representations. So this is a teacher. You can see it. We only have 3 categories, so this was earlier work. And this was a teacher who we talked about the technologies that were available to her and just talked about the ecology of resources, offered her the framework, and she went away and drew this diagram. Obviously, we provided the printed centre and she put in her particular resources. This was a whole group of teachers doing this. And without exception, they all identified things they hadn't thought of using before when they were doing this work on the ecology of resources. For analysis, we generally represent the ecology of resources as a table. So this is informationally equivalent to the diagram, but it's much easier to work with because you can put a lot more information in it. And this is actually an example taken from some work that we were doing with teenagers about energy consumption and their personal energy consumption. So it's a different way of representing the ecology of resources. And this was the representation that Nesta chose to use in their report. They've drawn it as a diamond rather than a circle. I don't know why, but different people see it in different ways. But it has all the vital ingredients, so it's not a problem. In order to help you understand the huge amount of information that I've just given you, I'm going to work through an example. And it's a very small scale, it's a big scale piece of work, but I'm going to do a very detailed example because I'm hoping that's going to help you see how you could use this in reality. So this is a trainee teacher doing a lesson plan. It's a primary school teacher, so actually it's quite in line with what Albert was talking about. We work with a group of primary school teachers, and this was just one example. And I have taken some of the detail out because otherwise it would be impossible to read on the screen. So stage 1, what are the resources that you've got available to you in your classroom when you're wanting to plan your lesson? Yep, so listed some of these resources. What do you want to do? So at the top you can see it says focus of attention, creative writing for 10-year-olds, okay? So she wants to write a lesson plan for creative writing for 10-year-olds, and these are the resources she's got available to her. So now we'll go to the table because we need to start categorising them. So we've divided those resources into the 4 categories. That's okay. That's straightforward. And then we've started to identify some filters. Now, these aren't all of the filters, but these are the ones that turned out to be more important. So these are the ones I've left in. So the environment, which is, of course, physical and virtual these days. So that's quite complicated, the notion of environment. There are many things that filter access to the environment. But in this particular scenario, the school timetable and the school rules were the key things that were going to have an impact on whatever lesson planning activity she could complete. Again, when it came to the people, the timetable and school rules were still filtering what was going on, but also accepted practices, particularly with respect to parents. When it came to the tools, use of laptop computers, other resources, and there's a huge number of them. Classroom protocol filters how children interact with these, and also resource allocation. There isn't a laptop for every child. So if they're going to use that technology, then there has to be some mechanism by which they're shared out. And the knowledge and skills, the teacher decided that she wanted to look at writing, as I said, creative writing, and a couple of the filters there were, in the UK, the national curriculum. I could say so much more, but I'm not going to. And the programme of study that the school has designed in order to meet the needs of the curriculum. And the resources that the learner brings are huge. But For example, and this is why I've put the dots everywhere because there's so much more, when it comes to the environment, physical abilities make a difference. When it comes to people, interpersonal skills, of course, make a difference. When it comes to the tools, yeah, physical abilities make a difference again, but if it's the laptop, then computer literacy and self-regulation makes a difference when it comes to taking advantage of those tools. Knowledge and skills, huge amount of things. Imagination, confidence, critical reflection, decoding, if it's language, semantic awareness, motivation, these are all the kinds of resources that you want to interact with as the learners doing their creative writing. But thinking particularly in terms of tools and people in this notion of the more able partner, who are the people who might help that learner with this creative writing task? Yes, of course, it's the teacher and the teaching assistant. It might be peers and friends, but could it also be parents? And then again, we add some filters, because if we're going to engage parents in this activity, then the rules and protocols in the home come into play because we've moved beyond the classroom. And again, it's confidence, critical reflection and motivation make a difference to how the learner will interact with these potential more able partners who can help them. So now we're starting to get somewhere, and we can start pinpointing, or at least this is what the teacher picked out, as the key things that she was going to focus on. Because she can't do everything. She's doing creative writing, so she's picked out interactive whiteboard and World Wide Web, timetable, the people, parents, peers, teaching assistants, timetable again as being the laptop, computer, actually resource allocation should be highlighted there, and knowledge and skills, yes, it's the curriculum. Now, obviously, this didn't happen. I'm doing this quite quickly. This took a lot of discussion and processing. So then we start looking at the relationships. So there are relationships between resources that we need to think about, and the relationships between resources and filters that we need to think about. So we've identified the different resources and the filters and what the learner brings to the situation themselves. Now we need to think about relationships. If you remember that design framework, that complicated design framework, but it had 3 phases. The first one was about identifying resources and filters. The second one was about identifying relationships. And this is the point of identifying relationships. So, we're now pinning it down to creative writing for 10-year-olds, writing and sharing a story. And we are going to use a laptop computer, which requires the learner's computer literacy, and it requires the teacher to think about resource allocation. We're going to do composition and communication, so they're going to do writing, and how does that fit in with the programme of study. We're going to use teachers, teaching assistant, peers and parents, and we're going to use the interactive whiteboard and the World Wide Web. Because what we're going to do is children are going to draft a story using the laptop. We've got to share it. They're going to share that story on the interactive whiteboard with their friends, with teachers, teaching assistants. And then they're going to have their story put on the school intranet, and parents are going to be given access to that so that they can share their story with their parents and talk about it. So, thinking about the relationships, the relationship between resources that the teacher decided she needed to focus on was the one between the laptop computer and the knowledge and skills that the children needed. And this was for a very practical reason, was that children were used to composing on paper. They weren't used to writing on the laptop, so they actually ended up drafting on paper and then typing into the laptop, which worked much better because she had to work out how to allocate the resources of the laptops between the children fairly. And when it came to the relationship between resources and filters that she picked on, it was the one with the parents that she was concerned about, because this was something new that hadn't been done before. It wasn't part of the accepted practices to share children's written work in this way on the internet, because any parent would be able to look at any child's story, not just your own. So this was quite a different thing. And parents were reticent to comment on their children's stories, so she offered parents advice about the kinds of things it would be useful for them to look at in the story. So she recognised the difference in the interaction, the difficulties in the interactions and relationships, and she supported those interactions. Now, as it turns out, and this isn't engineered in the least, and I have no idea what the connection between the teacher we were working with and this company, but actually a company called Pobble is doing precisely what this teacher engineered in her lesson plan as a commercial enterprise. And they've got 33,000 stories being shared around the world. Children write the story in school, and Pobble put it on their internet, and people are able to comment on it if they're members of Pobble. And what's nice about it is you can see a child's development over time, because say they've got 6 pieces of writing up over a period of a year, you can see how their writing's progressed over a year. I just thought it was really interesting that these two things had happened. As far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, there's no connection between the teacher and the company, but it was interesting. Okay, now one thing that's very clear in what I've presented so far is I've said nothing about the passage of time. What I've shown you in the representations has been very much a snapshot. Here are the resources, here are the relationships, but I haven't said anything about time. And actually the passage of time is really important. And so one of the other things that we've been working on is looking at the representation of time. So here is another example that is from a language learning context, an adult language learner who has been speaking English for many years, but who is sitting in the pub, and she hears the football on the television, and the commentator says something like, "He's at 6s and 7s," which is a very quirky English expression. She wants to know what that means. She doesn't know what that means. She asks her friend about the expression, and he's not very clear. So she moves her ring from her right hand to her left hand, because that's what she does as she's trying to remember to look things up. This was an interview, I should say. This data came from Inez, who was interviewed. Inez is not her real name. When she gets home, she notices her ring and looks up the expression. At first, she can't remember exactly what it is, but she remembers it has something to do with 6s and 7s, and she finds it and finds that it means in a state of total confusion or disarray. And she's now more confident about understanding it. Now, I could take that passage and represent it in one of those diagrams with resources and arrows. But actually, what we've done, and I'm sorry it's complicated, is time is going from left to right. The resources categories are at the top. If you look, knowledge and skills, environment, people, tools. And then we have the learner here with their resources. And basically, the actions that have been taken are tracked across this chart, and the resources that are being used are highlighted in bold. So you can see this episode 1, TV, episode 2, conversation with friend who doesn't really know what the expression means, episode 3, when Inez is back home and she's looking up the expression. I'm not expecting you to take the detail of this chart in. I'm just showing it to you to demonstrate that there's a way of representing time, so you can see how resources come into use and out of use, which if you're analysing data to try and understand how better to design resources is a very useful thing to be able to do. Right. The last question I was given was this: which are the future scenarios for lifelong learning and life-wide learning? Well, I've only got 2 here. There could be so many, but unsurprisingly, given my background, the 2 that I am choosing to offer are really motivated by what I think artificial intelligence has to offer in the future. Because artificial intelligence has been a subject for educators for over 25 years. There's quite a large community But it's only in the last few months that, in the UK at least, but I think it's quite global, artificial intelligence has suddenly become the subject of conversation, the likes of Google DeepMind and various other things going on, that people are interested again in what artificial intelligence might offer education. And I think there are huge possibilities for learning ecologies when we look at AI. So first one is the Internet of Things. I know a lot of what many of you do is online learning, but the Internet of Things, which connects multiple devices and sensor-based devices and allows everything to talk to each other, a bit like Caroline was talking this morning about her fridge. Well, not her fridge, but a fridge. There's a big possibility for everything to be online, everything we do to be online. So all of our resources to be tracked, which if you combine that with the explosion of interest in big data and learning analytics, and you start thinking about the kinds of data that we'll be able to collect about learners' interactions, both physical and digital, because all of these physical devices will be connected, I think it'll be a challenge to use that information, but the potential to use that information to develop richer learning ecologies and much better learning ecologies in terms of the quality of the interactions that they support and the sorts of resources that are available, I think are huge. So I think the Internet of Things combined with learning analytics has got lots of potential for learning ecologies. And the second one is the expanded teacher ecology of resources. As you will have gathered from what I've said, I work a lot with trainee teachers. That's what we do a lot of at the Institute of Education. And I think we're now actually in the space where our artificially intelligent teaching assistant up here, that's actually a Siri representation apparently. I didn't know that Siri had these representations, but apparently she does, or he does. But our virtual teaching assistant combined with teachers all over the world mean that actually our teachers will have resources at their fingertips that will combine human and artificial intelligence in a way that should benefit themselves and learners. I don't know what the situation is in Spain, but in the UK we have a looming crisis in teacher shortage. There's a real problem with teachers leaving the profession and with reduced number of teachers signing up for teacher training. So we're staggering at the moment, but in not too short a time, it is a real problem. Now, this kind of scenario can very much help in that, because it can be that actually you don't have an expert in computer science, but you sign in to somebody who's on the other side of the world who's going to actually help you. And then on another occasion, you've got your artificial teaching assistant who's going to help you. So it could be that these mechanisms can give teachers a much richer and bigger ecology of resources to help them in their job. The challenge then will be to help them find their way through this massive complexity so that they can make the most of it. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.